Hello everyone, welcome to the predicted record for the 2024 Ole Miss Rebels. This is going to be a very interesting team because of how many pieces they brought through the transfer portal. And unlike Colorado, they're not just bringing in transfers and hoping they replace the terrible roster they had before. Ole Miss had a solid foundation of superstars that are coming back this year, and then they're adding portal pieces around them to hopefully get better. It's no secret that the transfer portal for Ole Miss has been what the high school apparatus is for other schools, because if Ole Miss was doing this through straight up high school guys, they'd be able to get some guys, but they would not be able to compete with schools like Alabama and Georgia at this. And so you take a lot of other schools' talented players and you plug them in where needed, and Ole Miss becomes a really scary team with the foundation of established superstars that they've had in previous years. At quarterback, Jackson Dart, he's a superstar, he's back. At wide receiver, Trey Harris, he's a superstar, he's back. At tight end, Caden Prescorn, he's a superstar, he's back. At linebacker, Sunterin Perkins, he's a superstar, he's back. And so you see how you can have maybe a team that is better than the sum of its parts. And so as we look at the schedule, 3 of the first 4 games for Ole Miss should be cakewalks. Furman and Middle Tennessee, let's get those out of the way. They're ones. You should not even be entertaining the idea of them losing these games unless they are just in the complete disaster season. At Wake, it's very close to a 1, but I gave it a .75 because they're playing over there, and it is a Power 5 opponent. They're a level above Middle Tennessee and Furman. Wake has had a clear drop-off after Hartman left. You see now they're not producing at the level that they once were. It's not a knock against Dave Clawson, but it's very hard to consistently win at the level they were winning at a program like Wake Forest, and so you're going to have some losing seasons in a while. And even if Wake is good this year, I don't really see them beating Ole Miss, so I have that as a .75. Georgia Southern's another one, even with Clay Helton as the coach, where Ole Miss should take care of business, that's a 1. Then you get Kentucky at home. Ole Miss played Kentucky at home 2 years ago, if I remember correctly. They seem to like adding Kentucky to the Ole Miss schedule whenever possible. They did it in 2020 as well. Kentucky has Brock Vandagriff at quarterback, which is an interesting transfer because the biggest knock against him is that he doesn't really have much game experience. And while Brock Vandagriff might not have a lot of in-game experience, he does have a lot of experience at Georgia in practice, practicing against a lot better players than he will play against on Kentucky's schedule. I did give this a .75 just by a hair because I know Kentucky wins and they take care of business. They don't do so against teams more talented than them that are not named Florida. And so if nothing else, home field pushes this to a .75 for Ole Miss. Then you get at South Carolina, another .75. South Carolina has athleticism at the quarterback position, which we all know. You have Lenora Sellers and you have Robbie Ashford, very good quarterbacks, if for nothing else other than the fact that they can do a lot. Lenora Sellers in particular has a very strong arm and just a lot of ability as a quarterback. They did lose skill position players, probably the most notable of which is Juice Wells, which is now on the Ole Miss team. But also, they lose Xavier Legette to the NFL, which is a huge loss for them. I don't know how they're going to replace the skill position talent on a team that was already kind of not good last year, even with some talented pieces there. And I have no idea what the defense is going to do for South Carolina. So that's a .75 even in Columbia. At LSU is a .5. I think LSU running backs really have to step up for their offense to maintain altitude, or at least be close to what they were last year. I don't know that it's realistic to expect them to be the same as last year, with losing Jaden Daniels and now Garrett Nussmeier, who doesn't have the same running skill set. But just going along with the running skill set, LSU running backs need to pick up the production that Jaden Daniels had last year. I think this could be a shootout as well. Particularly if LSU's defense doesn't improve. I think that with the way Ole Miss plays ball, there's a ceiling on defensive play. But for LSU, they just need to do fundamentals better. LSU couldn't tackle last year. They couldn't cover guys. Everyone wants to talk about Harold Perkins, and he's a very good player, but the other 10 guys have to do something too. There's also something to be said about the fact that Lane Kiffin, in his time at Ole Miss, has not beaten LSU in Tiger Stadium. Even the horrific 2020 LSU team, Ole Miss couldn't beat them in Tiger Stadium. So I have it as a 0.5. I think both teams are very talented. I think it could go either way. I think it's going to be a close game. But you have to consider that even as much as people think this Ole Miss team is going to be a playoff contender and all that, you have to consider that the LSU game is going to be a tough game for them to win. Oklahoma is also going to be a tough game for them to win, even at home. I have that as a 0.5. Ole Miss is off a bye, and Oklahoma just played South Carolina, so I'm not expecting South Carolina to be a very tough opponent, but there's the bye factor that you also have to consider. It's Jackson Arnold's team. He's the quarterback there. It's going to pretty much entirely depend on his level of play, which I think can be good after they lose Dylan Gabriel at quarterback. Offensive line depth, and especially as you get deeper into the season for Oklahoma, offensive line depth is a huge deal. They have 3 transfers starting on the offensive line, and behind them you look at the depth chart, or the projected depth chart, and it's freshman, sophomore, freshman, something like that. And I also would say that maybe that's where the run game has gone. Oklahoma recently hasn't been known for its running back run game. Dylan Gabriel did a lot of that last year, and so they're kind of like in a situation like LSU where they've got to manufacture a running game to stay in these games. And passing game, I'm not super concerned about. I believe in Jackson Arnold as a quarterback, but also they brought in Deion Burks out of the transfer portal. That's going to be a superstar player for Oklahoma. So, game's rated at 0.5, and we move on to at Arkansas. Here's a fun fact. Ole Miss has not beaten Arkansas in Fayetteville since 2008. Now, they've won some games in Little Rock in that span, but they've never won in Fayetteville since 2008, since Bobby Petrino was the head coach there, and he's now the offensive coordinator. Scheduling dynamics are pretty big for this one, I would say. Both teams have a big game right after this one, but Ole Miss plays the tougher game before this one. So, if there's any sense of sandwich spot, it would be this for Ole Miss, because Ole Miss plays Oklahoma right before this, and they play Georgia right after this. Now, Arkansas plays Texas the next week after this, so it's 2 big games in a row for them. But I do wonder how much the Arkansas discourse around people expecting them to be bad this year had to do with just how awful Dan Enos was as an offensive coordinator, and he still kept them in games. They were losing a lot of one-score games at Arkansas last year. And so you just get a little bit of a push from a better offensive coordinator, and you can see that maybe some of those losses turn into wins. And especially with a team like Ole Miss that has struggled in Fayetteville. Now, obviously, the past struggles aren't going to affect this game this year, so it's not a huge deal. But Arkansas isn't as beatable as I think some people think that they are. Home field is why I'm giving this a 0.5, because if this were played in Oxford, it'd be a 0.75 for Ole Miss. Ole Miss is just that level above them in terms of talent, and especially with the unknowns at quarterback for Arkansas. They are deep at running back and tight end, but it's going to be a struggle for Arkansas to win games this year, even as I'm pointing out how people think that they're going to be worse than I think they're going to be this year. I think if Arkansas can get to a bowl this year, that'd be huge for them. I'm not going to spend much time on this because I don't really have a lot of notes for it. Georgia comes into Ole Miss, and that's a 0.5 for me. And I'm making it a 0.5 with respect to the home field for Ole Miss. Ole Miss went to Georgia last year, and they had a really talented, really good team, and they're going to have that again this year. But even with as good as Ole Miss was last year, and even as mortal as Georgia was last year, Georgia played some close games against teams worse than Ole Miss last year. But they beat Ole Miss by 5 touchdowns last year. And so you wonder about the scalability against better teams of what Ole Miss does. And even in the post-game presser for that game last year, I remember Lane Kiffin specifically saying, that he knows that they have inferior players. He didn't use those words, obviously. But, I mean, Georgia's bigger and faster than everyone else, and they're going to push people around, and you've got to really play well to beat them. And that's not going to change just because the year changes. What Georgia does and what Kirby Smart does at Georgia isn't something that goes away after a period of time. We talked about Wake earlier. Wake can pop in a year, and they have in the past before. A few years ago, they won 10 games, I think. So Wake can do that, and then be terrible the next few years because they lose all those guys that did that. Georgia loses guys, and then they replace them with guys that are just as, or maybe even more talented than the guy that they replaced. So that's what these ultra-talented teams do. So yes, that's a 0.5. And only for the home field aspect. If they were playing this in Athens, it'd be a 0.75, or it'd be a 0.25, I mean, for Ole Miss. At Florida. This is another schedule dynamic game. Florida, I don't know what their mental state is going to be at this point. Florida's going to be in that part of their schedule where they're playing a lot of tough teams. Now, those tough teams are not just guaranteed losses for Florida, because I think there's really only a couple of games on Florida's schedule where they're completely out of it and they're going to need a miracle to beat their opponent. Ole Miss is not one of them, especially in Gainesville. I don't know that people understand. Florida's been losing the past couple of years. It's not because Billy Napier's a bad coach, and it's not because they lack talent. You know, sometimes you've got a bigger cultural overturn than you realize. And Dan Mullen's culture was bad. They were winning those first 2 years under Dan Mullen. But Billy Napier's got things in the right direction, even if they don't win this year. I still believe that. And so I don't know what their mental state will be. If they're as culturally sound as I think they are, it'll be fine. But, you know, you never know. If you lose a lot of games in a row, you never know what that locker room's going to do. And oh, by the way, Ole Miss has a bye before this game. Florida plays LSU before this game. So that's the schedule dynamic I was talking about before, where it's like everything is set up against Florida this year. And we'll see what happens, but I have it as a 0.5 for home field. Mississippi State is a 0.75. They're an inferior opponent to Ole Miss. Actually, it's amazing the cross-contamination these coaching staffs have had. Jeff Lebby, the head coach at Mississippi State, was on Ole Miss's staff a few years ago as their offensive coordinator. And then Mississippi State's defensive coordinator, then head coach Zach Arnett, is now on Ole Miss's staff. So, just a weird rivalry where things like that just happen. And I think Lebby is in for a tough year one, just with the situation he was handed at Mississippi State. And Ole Miss is clearly, you know, completely above Mississippi State in almost every aspect of roster, and they're playing the game in Oxford. So I have this as a 0.75. And so the total for Ole Miss is 9-3, which is not what people are going to want to see. People are hyping them up as a playoff team, as a team that should make it to the SEC championship game against maybe Georgia or Texas, or if they're not in the SEC championship game, they're that third team that doesn't make it in. I could see all that happening, but I think there's tougher games on Ole Miss's schedule than people realize, and I don't think they're all just gimmies. People look at LSU, and they don't like Brian Kelly, and they say, oh, Ole Miss should take care. Because Lane Kiffin has a likable personality that's palatable to a lot of people. Oh, he's funny, or oh, he's cool, oh, he doesn't do it like other coaches. And so just based on that, I think that's where the bias is in terms of the fan base. But in terms of actual team, and you never know when you take in all these transfers, even with all the superstar players I listed at the beginning of the video, even taking that into account, you never know how transfers are going to pan out. There's transfers that look super good going into the year, and you think this is going to be a key contributor. Yeah, Auburn knows that firsthand. I'm an Auburn fan. We did that last year, and we had a losing record. So, Ole Miss, I think, is going to be a good team. We'll see if they're as good as people think they are. I do think that some of the games on their schedule are more losable than people think. So that's it for me. If you have any teams that you want to see in this format, please leave them in the comments. I will obviously take those into account. And have a good one.